Welcome, everybody, to New Hampshire Theater Project and Community Connectors. Welcome to everyone that's watching out in the rest of the world, for all of you who came here tonight. I am Genevieve Achel, the Executive Director, and we have a wonderful panel here tonight. They're going to tell us all how we can come out of our post-COVID funk and get spiritual. But seriously, this program, the Community Connectors, we started about 2 years ago in conjunction with our Mainstage season. So with every show, we tease out one of the most important themes of the show and talk about that. This current show, the Mainstage show, which is Small Mouth Sounds, and we do still have tickets left, 2 more weekends. It's a great show. What is it Liz wrote in her review? You will laugh your heart open. So we hope you will come and see that. But the show is about searching for spiritual enlightenment, if you will, in our secular life. And so that's our theme for tonight, is spirituality in a secular world. And what is spirituality? So we have a great panel, as I said, and our host tonight is company artist Drew DeSimone. So thank you to him. Also to our other artist, CJ Lewis, who's manning the cameras, and to Josh Goldberg, who will be managing the chat online. So we hope those of you at home, if you have questions or comments, please participate, type them in the chat, and we will share them with our panel up here. And now I'm going to turn this over to Drew.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Jen. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the panel. So historically, spirituality has been thought of as part and parcel with religion. But more recently, mindfulness practices, meditative practices, scientific approaches, philosophical approaches have really brought spirituality into more of a humanist outlook. Humanism is often thought of as, or credited as, popularizing secularism, which has led to the belief that religion and humanism are pitted against each other in a narrow duality. But more recently, the post-secular term has re-enlivened the idea that religion has an important part to play in our social and political construct. So, in order to communicate and collaborate as a community, we first have to understand each other and listen. Therefore, as Jen just said, we've chosen to use this Community Connectors event to focus on the question of what is spirituality? And we have a fantastic panel here to help us discuss that question. But we also want to hear from you, whether you're in the theater tonight or at home watching from the comfort of your dry, warm living room. There will be a Q&A at towards the end of our discussion, so please feel free to put your questions in the chat. They'll be relayed, or raise your hand. We'd love to hear from you. And before we get started, I want to offer that what is spirituality is really an impossible question, because spirituality can mean something very different to each one of us. So spirituality can often be very beneficial, thinking about practicing a spirituality. So I invite us all to listen and share our own ideas on what spirituality is. Without further ado, I want to introduce our panel. Bill Redfield is a wisdom teacher and former parish minister. Liz Korabek-Emerson is a mindfulness practitioner and member of the Natural Dharma Fellowship. And Robert Sapiro, not Shapiro, Robert Sapiro is the Director of Community Outreach at the Acre Baha'i Center of Learning. Thank you all very, very much for being here. So I want to start by asking you each the very same question. What is spirituality to you, and how do you and your organizations think about, access, and use spirituality? Bill, can I start with you?
I'm working with a blank slate, which is fantastic. Spirituality, for starters, spirituality, I think, has something to do with how Liz and Robert and I just recently got to know each other a little bit. My sense immediately was that there was an openness and an honesty amongst us, and I want to start with that. It's very deeply appreciated by me. What is spirituality? I like to think of spirituality as an understanding of life that goes beyond our individual, separate lives. That we, although we've been taught in our modern Western culture that we are individuals and that development is individual development, and we focus completely on how an individual is going to live out his or her potential, a spiritual point of view, as I understand it, takes into account our embeddedness in all of life. We are actually integral parts of a greater whole. And spirituality is about living more deeply into that embeddedness so that we live beyond our individual selves. For me, in what I call a wisdom tradition, and maybe I'll have the opportunity to explain that a little bit later, but in that, part of what needs to happen in order for us to get that sense of our embeddedness in all of life is to move from our heads exclusively and having all of our apprehension through our minds down into our bodies. Because our hearts, the vibrational resonance of our hearts and our bodies know a deeper wisdom. And our hearts and bodies know that we are connected with all of life. Lastly, I'll say that I'm going to give you guys a chance. Lastly, I'll say that our advances in science, usually religion and science are often characteristically pitted against each other. But with the development of quantum knowledge, quantum physics, it's really saying much of what spiritual masters have been saying for all the ages, that all life is connected. And that if you really want a meaningful life, you will develop that connection to all of life. And so we'll be talking about spiritual practice, I'm sure. So that's a start.
Great. Liz?
What he said. I'll put it in my own words. I think of spirituality as the framework that we use to understand what is beyond our understanding. And that's essentially the human condition. And from a Buddhist point of view, we would say birth, old age, sickness, and death. And just that experience of being alive in this moment and knowing that will come to an end. It'll come to an end for me, for you, and for everyone in this room and out in the Zoom room. And that is beyond our rational understanding. And so how do we make sense of that? And how do we sort of touch in on our essential nature, not unlike what you were saying, that sense of connectedness to all of life. And again, from the kind of Buddhist point of view of understanding that our natural ability to be aware and our natural capacity in our minds is for wisdom and compassion. And that is our true nature. And that is what allows us to feel that sense of connectedness to all of humanity. I think I'll leave it there.
All right, so they covered it. And,
Yeah.
well, that pretty much does. So I think, I guess I would add from my little view in the universe, I think of spirituality in part as a way to both kind of grow individually, but also to be able to contribute to the collective, right? So to be able to, and I feel like those two need to go hand in hand. I feel like spirituality, when I sort of think of an approach that's purely material, I feel like there's a lot of things that become barriers. I think a lot about social justice issues and about, how do we move beyond racism and sexism, homophobia, all these different things. And when I think of my social identity alone, right, if I'm thinking, I'm Robert, who is a white man who does, if that's how I'm thinking of myself, then there's a lot of limitations on where I can go, right? But if I think of myself as a spirit or a soul who's continuing sort of beyond this material realm, then that allows me to be able to get over myself, right? And be able to connect with others, at least hopefully, right? So I feel like that's kind of how I see spirituality in terms of, how it affects sort of daily life. You'd also mentioned sort of organizationally how that works. So Greenacre is a Baha'i center of learning. It's not a house of worship, but it's really a gathering place for people to come together, families, friends, collaborators of different backgrounds, where they can think about questions of, how can they contribute to applying justice, peace, the oneness of humanity, to build a kind of a diverse and united society. That's sort of what we're aiming for. But without the spiritual part, right, then you get into the identity conflicts and the, who has power over who and all those things. And not that those aren't part of our social reality and have to be reckoned with, but overcoming them, I think, requires something else, at least in my view. So.
That's really interesting, Robert. So if I understand you correctly, Greenacre's position is really to support that growth or contribution as you described it. How do you reckon with the differences? Is the path for how the folks who participate at Greenacre get there important, or more the outcome?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Yeah, it's really more the outcome, I think, is what, so I think the other kind of point of view I have, which is that we all have some portion of the truth, right? I mean, it's that metaphor that I think is used. I don't know if it's a Sufi tradition. Maybe the Buddha said it. No, I don't know who said it. So you have an elephant, and that analogy, right? And somebody's touching the trunk, and they say, "It's a tree. It's a tree. I swear it's a tree." And another person, "It's a snake." And they have so that view is that we need all of these different views to be able to get at it. And if we can listen to each other with, "Oh, you just mentioned part of the truth that I might not see," right? Then we can build on something. And then I can also say, "I'm seeing this," and you can say, "Oh, well, I didn't see that before." So I feel like that's how striving to do that, rather than, "Hey, everybody, it's a tree. You guys have got to believe it's a tree, or we're not going anywhere." So
yeah. And Liz, you were talking about spirituality as a way to understand what is beyond our understanding. And it seems to me like not only our intellect, but the relationship between the things that we need to understand as human beings and science as being one way that we understand them. Taking cancer, for example, I was watching a YouTube video on cancer today, one of my favorite YouTube channels, to sort of understand, the current understanding of cancer, our fight against cancer. So how do you think spirituality works with scientific approaches to garner that understanding?
Well, I think what Bill mentioned is really true, that we're finding that a lot of the science is actually coming around to truths that we've known in the wisdom traditions for a long, long time. There's a lot of work being done by Rick Hansen, who's a neuropsychiatrist, and he's has talking about how we really are connected, and all the ways in which our brain is really working, that are all truths that we can see in our practices, our spiritual practices. And so faith has gotten us to some truths, and science, we're finding, is getting us to those very similar same truths. And I think it's important that place where we don't understand things, where faith jumps in, is important. That's the space, I think, of spirituality. And while, there's a lot of evidence right now of why we should slow down, we should meditate, we should be in community, and all those kinds of things, we know that like you said, in our hearts and in our bodies. We know that from our experience. And our experience is our greatest teacher. Right? We find that. So the science, it's nice that the science is backing it up, but often I'll read the science thing and I think, well, they should have called me. or anybody else I know on the planet. I'm like, oh, okay. Like they're in the science, they're talking about the natural negative bias of the mind, that we tend to be negative. And they're looking at it, and they've studied it, they have all these grants, and I think, oh, if only I'd gotten that grant money. And, and I often say to my meditation students, I'll say, you know this. When you walk into the room, everyone smiles at you except for that one person. What do you notice? What do you think about? That's a natural negative bias of the mind. You know this in your heart and in your bones.
Malcolm Gladwell talks about that in Talking to Strangers, part of the truth default, and it's a defense mechanism, it seems. That's really interesting. So Bill, wisdom work. Tell us how you came to wisdom work. Was it something that was always part of your practice, or did you come to it more recently?
I met in 1990. I met a spiritual teacher who told me much of what I had always known, but I hadn't given it credence, and I hadn't had the courage to articulate it myself. This person, her name is Cynthia Bourgeot, and she is she's also an Episcopal priest, as I am. But she was on this wisdom path. And as I heard this, it made more and more sense to me. So what I did, at that point, I was in parish ministry, working for the organized church and everything. and I very carefully, very gently folded in a lot of wisdom understandings into my Christianity. And I was able to do that. But since I've retired, I've been able to step more fully out into that wisdom path. And maybe I'll just give you one example, because it relates to what you were saying, Robert. When I was in central New York and serving that parish, I was the convener of the Round Table of Faith Leaders. And so we had all the faiths represented sitting around the table. And I was able to sort of change it from more of like a board meeting to a real encounter, so that we could really, really engage with each other. And what I discovered is that wisdom is actually that path down to this underground stream that runs, I think, underneath all of the established spiritual traditions. And if you just take things on the surface, you find tremendous divergence and disagreement in beliefs, practices, rituals, and so forth. But if you take all of those traditions down, they all sort of meet at this much deeper level that I would call wisdom. And part of just responding to what Liz was saying, part of my understanding is that so often we get to see things in the bright sunlight of the daytime. And there's tremendous clarity, especially what science tells us and so forth. And yet the entire 24-hour period also includes the nighttime. And in the night, it's mystery. We come to the edges of ourselves and we don't understand everything. And we find that we have to live into the mysteries. And it's those two, as they fit together, sort of living simultaneously on the horizontal and the vertical at the same time. And that's a challenge, but I think that's what spirituality really is in this day and age.
That's fascinating. Listening to you all talk, there are a couple of really common themes. We're talking about connectedness, we're talking about understanding, intellect, but that awareness that is unique to human beings, that part of our evolution, our big brains, as Vonnegut would refer to them, that allows us to have that awareness is really interesting, because without that, none of this would be possible. Living on the edge of that mystery, that understanding, which seems to be where our spirituality, our search for the unknown, and our understanding meet, is uniquely human, I think, or perhaps as far as we know it, uniquely human. So before we move on to our more serious questions for the evening, I want to ask a lighthearted question. So let me pose it to you, and then I'm going to pause for station identification. The fun question is, do animals experience spirituality? So if human beings have that unique awareness and intellect that we don't think of or really understand other animal brains to work, they don't have that sapience, that awareness. So can they experience spirituality? But as you're thinking about that, Jen and Josh, I forgot my phone, my watch, so give me like the 15-minute warning so I can open things up, okay?
It's 5 to 5. Or 5 to 6, right?
It's 5 to 6, okay. So please give me a 15-minute warning at least, okay? Thank you very much. All right, who wants to answer my
I
animal
do.
question first?
Oh,
All right,
good.
Bill, jump in.
Maybe the mistake is having a term like spirituality. That says that it's different than the rest of life. I think what my dog knows the whole of life. There is no section of life that's spiritual. But he's fully present in life just as it is. He may have some preferences. He likes to be fed before 5. He's got
AM or PM?
PM. Okay. Thank you for that clarification. So we have preferences, of course, but the capacity to be present in our lives just as it is. That sounds kind of Buddhist, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does kind of sound.
That's what it's all about. And so maybe the mistake is trying to segment off a part that's spiritual as opposed to the rest. Is that a trick answer?
It's a great answer. I have an elderly cat and an elderly dog that I have a similar type of experience with. So it's really interesting to think about them experiencing life in that way. They're not expecting anything more.
No. And they're happy.
And
Yeah.
I was going to say they're happy.
And they're happy.
There's the key, right? Just be where you are. Expect food at 5.
Yeah.
Do either of you have animals at home?
I do not. We're getting bees, so you
Oh.
know.
Yeah,
Thank
do bees have spirituality? I guess that's
I
the
don't know.
question.
I'm about to find out.
Well, okay, we can move on. So, as you all know, these community connectors are put on in coordination with our Mainstage show, and currently our Mainstage show is Small Mouth Sounds, directed by the one and only man behind the camera, C.J. Lewis. In Small Mouth Sounds, 6 individuals with very different life experiences all enroll in a silent retreat. You're looking at the set of it right now. Each troubled and searching for answers of some sort, and the play really asks how we address life's biggest questions without our words. So I want to dig a little bit deeper. I appreciate what you're saying, that there is a connectedness even between our different definitions of spirituality. But perhaps for those folks who are listening, for myself, I'm constantly challenging myself in this way, looking for some answers, looking for ways to deal with those difficult life questions that they're facing today. I want to dig a little bit deeper into wisdom work, Buddhism, the work at Green Acre, for example, and talk a little bit about how each of you advise folks to balance the learning and teaching that you do of a spiritual practice and the actual practicing of that spirituality. Another way to ask that question would be, at what time does spirituality become a solution for someone, potentially? And Robert, I'm going to start with you, if you don't
Great.
mind.
Well, good. That's not precisely what I was hoping for, but
Or, as we talked about before,
We're with you.
answer whatever question
that's
you want.
right, exactly. Well, so I'm getting a new car, and no. So I think it's a great question to think about where does teaching and learning begin or end, and where does application. And I think that's one of the things that, within the context of the Baha'i community, which Green Acre is part of, but is really striving to put into practice some of the teachings that come from the Baha'i faith, but in a very practical way. So, thinking about how we're kind of heavy on education and educational processes, but the kind of the idea of it is so that you take something simple like a notion that comes from the Baha'i writings that the betterment of the world can be accomplished through pure and goodly deeds, through commendable and seemly conduct. Nice to say, sounds pretty, oh, that's great, but how does that affect how I'm interacting with somebody while I'm buying coffee? Or how does that interact when I'm dealing with my elderly father? Or how does that actually come into play? What kinds of deeds am I doing? And are they commendable? And how do I reflect on that enough so that I've sort of absorbed that, but I can actually do it in real life, right? I mean, that's where the whole of it is. I think we end up with feeling a lot of hypocrisy with religious practice, perhaps, because these things are said and people do this, right? And everybody feels that, right? And so trying to integrate that as a practice and sort of focusing on how do you develop those habits for yourself so that you can contribute to community using those principles. So it's a really big part of, and I think for me, I guess the key to it is being in a continual process of studying and then taking action based on that study, but then reflecting on what actually happened, right? And having that period of reflection, so it's not just, oh, great, I thought of this thing. We're a doer kind of culture, right? So I did all this stuff. But if I don't take that time to reflect and say, oh, I was studying this about making the world better, and I did this. Some of it made it better, some of it actually made it tangibly worse. But so having that reflection period to constantly adjust. So that's.
Yeah. So, is the work at Green Acre, is the Baha'i community considered to be humanist? And let me phrase that question slightly differently, because Bill, I really appreciate a point that you've brought up. Is part of the problem in this conversation is that we rely on definitions too much. The solution is not that we agree to what a humanist is or what a Buddhist is. It's about having conversations like this and finding solutions that work for us individually while also sharing mutual respect and conversation amongst us. So I don't ask you that question as a way to define humanism, but as I said in my introduction, oftentimes humanism and religion are pitted against each other, right? So I'm just curious whether or not the Baha'i practices are considered humanist.
No, that's a really interesting question. I would say no, primarily spiritual would be the practice, the sort of the belief system, and very much comes from it is a part of a religion, right? But I think it's also a religion that focuses on the oneness of humanity, right? So when you have that combination, it very much appreciates the breadth and depth of human expression and the different points of view and all of these things. So very much honoring that, but also believing that we need spirituality as part of our development, for humans to develop, and sort of actually that we've gotten to a place on the planet where, we can acknowledge our interconnectedness, and in fact, it's impossible not to, right? What's happening in the Ukraine right at this moment is affecting all of our lives, as anything almost anywhere in the world would affect our lives. So unless we begin to see ourselves that way, and I think also have something that pushes us a little bit higher, right? If it's just competing interests, we're not going to get anywhere, right? We have to have something higher that we're drawing from.
Absolutely. Liz, how do Buddhists view the idea of solutions in learning?
Solution. Is that the same question you just asked him, or are you?
Well,
I mean.
The same question that I asked him first, and then I asked him a follow-up. So,
well, I often say to students that are taking meditation from me, I'm like, I always say, you need this for Thanksgiving, because that's where the rubber meets the road. When you're sitting there in your, with your family, or, and you're next to your sister, and your sister says the thing that she's been saying every year, and you say the thing that you've been saying every year, and then the 40-year-old fight breaks out. And that's where you really need that kind of thing. And I think, from the Buddhist tradition, we come to know the Dharma, or the truth, or the spirituality of it through listening to teachers. Lineage is very important in the Buddhist tradition. and through study, like you were talking about, and also practice. And so all of those things have to come together. And one of the things that I have thought about when you were asking that question is, you know, the teacher that I worked with just before I took my refuge vows, which is you just basically announcing you're a Buddhist. And he said this thing that I thought was really important. He said, if you're finding that over and over in your life, you have come to these teachings and they have given you some kind of comfort, or you see them as guidance, or you just keep finding yourself coming back to these and they're resonating with you, you're already a Buddhist. That's just a ceremony. And that's the moment I knew this is the thing that I'm going to follow, because for years I had, you know, I'd take a meditation retreat, I'd get all excited, and then I'd forget about things. And then the rubber would meet the road, I'd hit a speed bump, and I'd go, oh, that practice, or those books, or those teachings, or those people, they helped. And so over years of doing that. The other thing that I'll say from the Buddhist point of view, as opposed to secular mindfulness, so I'm a mindfulness teacher, so I teach mindfulness in a secular setting, and my personal practice is as a Buddhist in a community. And in the Buddhist community, we practice together. And there's something about sitting next to somebody, maybe on a silent retreat, who's snoring, coughing, quietly sobbing, not so quietly sobbing, you know, whatever it is, or, you know, or crinkling, and you're sitting there trying to like do your thing and reach enlightenment, maybe not today, but you know, soon, and like that's the rubber meets the road. And I often say to people, you know, this is not just a little private practice that you do for yourself. This is so you can be in the world and next to the person and witness each other and be together. And that's really, you want to take that practice out into the world. And that was the thing that really hooked me in terms of, I practiced Tibetan Buddhism, that your life is your practice. I'm considered a householder practitioner, right? So it's not a monastic tradition. So anyway. Right,
so I heard a rumor, Liz, that you attended opening night of Small Mouth Sounds, and you told someone in the audience afterwards that you, quote, have attended this retreat and know some of these people that you just saw on stage, these characters. So I'm curious, you sort of hinted at it a little bit there, but what did the play remind you of specifically?
So I also went on to say I've been some of those characters. So okay. I don't want to say that I'm excused from any of that bad behavior.
I can't imagine you as my character in any way, shape, or form. So
you know, the thing about I've been on a number of silent retreats. And there's something about stripping down like your ordinary things, like you get your coffee here and you do that and you go to work and stuff, that there's such a humanity, and people really kind of show up, I notice, as kind of their essential self. And some of that is the desperate clinging to who they think they are that they drag in like a pink overcoat, like the character in the play. And then you watch them kind of settle in sometimes, if all goes well, right? And there's also, people go to silent retreats for a lot of reasons, deepen their practice. But often there's a sense of longing and lossness that happens because people are seeking some kind of spiritual or just balm from the human condition, and the foibles just kind of leak out. We can't help ourselves. Right?
And oftentimes what's standing in their way they're not aware of until perhaps hopefully they go through that process and get some enlightenment and can actually address that change. I love how you started off by answering my first question, relating this to Thanksgiving dinner. So I'll ask you, Bill, when you're at Thanksgiving dinner or any family gathering and you're faced with your relatives' same stories or perhaps an annoyance from a big family gathering, what do you turn to get through those moments?
The turkey, mostly.
You're always the carver.
Yeah, no. This is a tremendous conversation here, and let me just pick up something that you said, Liz, because you were already a Buddhist. You were born a Buddhist. It's in your heart, and I think that much of what we need and who we are is already in us. So I'm from the Christian tradition, although I largely disidentify from a lot of expressions of Christianity because I think they've got it just wrong. That there's something wrong with us and we need religion to make us right and acceptable. No, Jesus never said that. But so I think we have what we need. We don't know that we have what we need. And so spiritual development is about unbinding ourselves from those identifications. And well, I think I've got to be this way. I think I got to be this way. And I'm going to get to the Thanksgiving question, I think. So well, what are we when all of that is unraveled? We are divine instantiations. We're expressions of the divine in human form, in unique, specific human form. And so if we knew that, if we could accept that about ourselves first and then about others, then we wouldn't get into these things that we often get into, because what we're actually doing is we're defending some turf that we tried to establish 40 years ago. and
or 400.
It's not about that. So that's why, and what I started with was, I think the three of us, I'll include you in that too, Drew.
I'll be the humanist up here.
Well, there was an immediate connection amongst us because we weren't trying to impress each other. Well, I'm a Christian, and we all had the sense that each of these paths is legitimate and has its own wonderful authority. So if we can help each other get to that point where we can unbind ourselves from that, what we end up being is beautiful human beings who know how to love and accept each other. I know that sounds really idealistic, but I think the way we get there is not encouraging people or telling people that they have to be good in order to get to heaven or whatever, but we allow them to grow more deeply into who they already are. Anyway.
And why not shoot for the ideals? That's a heck of an ideal to shoot for, I would say.
It's what this life has been created for. We're loving human beings, and we're called to love. And I, I'm at this point in my life, I'm turning 74 this summer, and I got nothing to lose. Do you know? I just try to take every opportunity that I can to be present and open, and yes, loving. And I'm not embarrassed about that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One of the other things, I'm really glad you talked about some of the traps or the conflicts that are often thought between these spiritual or religious practices, to exist between these spiritual and religious practices, because they're used oftentimes in our world to create conflict. And even in Small Mouth Sounds, there's a theme of human beings striving for connection in a fragmented world. So here's the question. Let's talk about some of those traps sometimes, because I think it's important to identify them. What is the role of spirituality, any of our spiritualities, in a world where we often assume that defensive pose over our differences? When when is spirituality when does it become a divider for us sometimes? Can we identify those examples so that we don't get hung up on them and we can focus on the positive outcomes that we can have through having these kind of conversations? So can you tell us a bit more about some of the traps that you've experienced?
Yeah, and I can make it very, very simple. When I'm operating in my head, and I do operate out of my head, my mind wants to make things right or wrong. And so if I'm right, I love being right, and you disagree with me, that makes you wrong. And that's a problem right there. That's when spirituality becomes a divider. But when I can enter my heart and my body, then it's not right or wrong, and it's not either or, it's both and. And I can embrace paradox. Buddhists are good at paradox. And that's really helpful. So again, you know, at this level, all these religions disagree with each other and fight wars with each other. But if you take those traditions down far enough, you get to a place of both and there's tremendous acceptance of all the other expressions of religion.
Mm.
And I would say at that level of, you know, to use your gesture, right?
I see where you're going.
Up here, we're not really talking about spirituality. We're talking about identity. Which
Exactly.
is what you were talking about,
Exactly.
which is getting used to sort of keep that division, which is getting used to sort of divide and conquer and hold on to power and keep us separate. You know, that's a dualistic word, a world. I'm right or wrong, it's black or white, you know, you're in, I'm out kind of thing. And I don't think that's what any of the religions are about.
No.
But they get used that way.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think it's really a challenge to think about how do we overcome those differences. This wasn't necessarily religious, but it was around just after George Floyd was murdered, and I happened to be in conversation with the local police chief. We're in Elliott. There's 6,000 people. It's not this tiny little town, right? And we had had a number of conversations about various things. But he came to me because he felt like, oh, here's somebody I can talk to about this, because he was getting tremendous amount of pressure from every direction, right? So he had some folks circle the wagons, this is terrible, police are great, don't worry about anything. And you had people like, when are you changing the policy? Is it going to happen tomorrow? Can I see it in writing? And so he was really in turmoil about how to respond. And so we ended up having a series of conversations with some of the folks, with a sort of interracial staff at Green Acre with the local police. In the midst of a very, and that really tested, so this kind of spirituality, if you want to call it, so strongly believe in the oneness of humanity. And one of the folks who was part of our team, Najee Brown, who's our artist in residence, African American man who grew up in Brooklyn, had yet to have a positive experience with the police, and there he is with the local police, and one of them was, apparently there was going to be a riot in Elliott the way he was dressed. He was fully strapped and ready to go, and right, and so it really tested, like, am I seeing this as another human, a real genuine human with a real spirit, beneath the identities, and so that was where the real practice had to come of, no, we believe in the oneness of humanity. So it takes, and everybody was offended by something, right, that happened in the conversation. It was painful for good parts of it. But then there also came to an interesting point of unity. Once we got to know each other, we got to laugh a little bit, we got to figure out how to make those connections. And so, one of the officers came in and said, what's with this black national anthem they just made up? And Najee was like, well, it's like 100 years old. And and I sang it every day as part of my school. And at that point, he was friends with Najee. And so he was like, maybe something's different here. And there was that moment. So I think that was an application of kind of spirituality, or, just taking a principle like that and applying it in a really tough situation.
Absolutely. 15? Thank you. Najee Brown, I'm sure most of you know who Najee Brown is, but for anyone who doesn't, is also a very talented local artist and director, and I would encourage you all to check out his work in local theaters if you have the chance. He's doing some fantastic work.
Yeah, well, actually, in a couple of weeks, April 9th at Green Acre, his play Nevaeh's Brother will be happening. I have stuff to hand out about that, but I wasn't planning on doing promotion for this. But what the heck? Why not?
I'm glad it came up. I'm glad it came up. Well, I have one more question that I'd like to ask you all briefly, because I do want to leave a significant chunk for questions, both from our theater audience as well as our YouTube audience. So I'll just make this really, really quick. We've talked a lot about the commonality of our human experience. I think that's really, really important for us to remember and to be thinking about whatever path and practice we take. And it seems to me that one of the commonalities of what it means to be human beings is that we struggle, we suffer, right? Bess Wohl even puts in her preface to Small Mouth Sounds, quoting the Buddha, I believe, Liz, correct me if I'm wrong, life is suffering. So I wonder if we each can just briefly share with our audience something that a personal struggle that we're going through right now, because to also quote the playwright, we are not alone. I'll start. I am playing a narcissistic yoga influencer in this play, Small Mouth Sounds, and I have the pleasure of working with several other artists, actors and artists from the Seacoast area who are tremendously talented. Many of them I haven't worked with before. And I had a real fear entering this project that because of my own process and just I'm an introvert and I'm insecure by nature, that they would learn Drew as my character Rodney. And it's been difficult for me to sort of balance those two things through the rehearsal and show process, and I've really just been trying to sit with that and think about how to process that. So that's the struggle I'm going through right now. Would anyone else like to share?
Bill does. Okay.
And you don't have to. I'm not putting you on the spot.
So I'm just going to twist it just a little bit, because I work with people who are in the arc of a wisdom transformation, moving from a very individual life to something deeper, broader, more loving, and I have found repeatedly that as people move into this, they experience suffering in different kinds of ways that is not their own. So this point isn't usually made, and that's why I want to make it. When we are joined to the rest of humanity, we can find ourselves suffering with things that don't belong to us necessarily. And yet we're so used to blaming ourselves for not feeling well, or something's wrong, or I'm not dealing with something. But it's actually something is really, really right. So I'm finding a lot of people suffering right now because of what's happening in Ukraine and the fact that it's just all over the TV and everything. And my work is to help them see that what they may be dealing with doesn't belong to them. It's something bigger. And it is a manifestation of this reality, the spiritual reality, that we're all connected.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Robert, Liz?
I'll say, sort of on the other side of things, we're 2 years into this pandemic era, and I have a meditation group that I've been leading throughout this time, and it was together before the pandemic really hit. Sort of the pervasive sense of uncertainty and shifting sands has been excruciating at times for people, including myself. And to be able to ride this wave, and we understand that this is actually the truth of reality all the time, uncertainty. but it's just been so much more obvious in the last couple of years. People have had to really recognize that. And so being able to sit with that, and for myself, that expectation that I should be able to handle it. It was just interesting for me to see where the wave would hit me would be different times than the group or particular people in the group, and that, you know, I'm just as, you know, part of it as anyone else. So being able to sit with my own vulnerability of that, so that there's space for other people's vulnerability for that. And that's an important part of the work that I do, to hold that space for that. And I have to be a part of that. All right, that's crucial, to sit in the so-called teacher seat.
Thank you.
I think for me, there's there's lots of different ways of that suffering happens, and I mean, I think I spent many years sort of recovering from my childhood, and there was lots of trauma that I experienced, and but I think right now the thing that sort of is the thing that I'm sort of holding and working through is, what does it mean to be a man in this world, and what does it mean to be a white man in this world, and how do I contribute to the kind of the kind of world that I would like to see, where racial justice and the equality of women and men are manifest, and both doing the internal work, but then also talking with those who are have these same social identities to transform. Like, so for me, that is it's many things, but it is painful, and it does require spirituality. Like, I don't know how else to work through it, to be honest with you. So,
thank you for sharing that. We can empathize with that, and I think it's a really important thing to be thinking about today, as it's long overdue. Questions from our audience? Do we have any? Oh, we have one right. I believe we have a mic. Jen, could we supply the mic? Thank you.
So the theme of connection has run throughout, but this kind of external connection. And as an introvert, as a person who can only do groups on my own terms, essentially, can you speak to the role of spirituality in your connection to yourself? Spirituality as a way to quiet the static, and we can feel untethered, particularly in this world right now. And before I can personally connect with others, I have to spend a great deal of time connecting and centering in myself. So can you speak a little more to that?
I think that, that's a really important question, and I think that place of, I am an extrovert, but I think that the importance of learning how to connect internally is really, really important, and otherwise the connection with others isn't genuine, right? I'm depending too much on connecting with others to fulfill something within myself, and one of the things I've been learning about is those patterns of thought in my head that go back ages, and I've analyzed them to death, but quelling them is actually the thing I need to do, right? There's always that voice in my head about how I'm going to be a failure and I'm never going to, whatever. It's 100% predictable, can apply to any situation. It's everywhere. Exactly. Yeah, look at that.
One size fits
all. Yeah, it's a black box. Put anything in and you come out with the same answer. And so learning how to quell, and I feel like that's connecting with myself, but also that, for me, that connection also has to be a simultaneous high. Like, it works best when it's both. Like, when I'm acknowledging what's happening inside, but I'm also then going higher and drawing from that, so then I can have the ability to connect genuinely with others.
I'm going to give a Buddhist answer. So for me, it's not so much silencing those self-critical things as it's seeing them for what they are, and finding that part of me that's articulating them, and then putting my arm around that part and say, okay, big guy, it's okay. It'll be okay here. Because I find many people on a spiritual path, especially a more traditional spiritual path, really try to be really nice to other people and kind and loving and so forth. And they're terrible. They're god-awful to themselves. And would never say to others what they say to themselves.
Yeah.
And so we have to start with self-compassion. If we can't be compassionate with ourselves, probably we're not going to be really compassionate to anyone else. It'll be an act. It'll be a show. And we're trying to get some product out of it. So it's that kind of consistency that I think is really important. And so it's learning to be gentle and loving with ourselves. I think it's really incredibly important, and I really thank you for asking that question.
And that would be the answer.
That was the Buddhist answer.
But that sense of that everything is welcome, and there's a Pema Chodron says that self-improvement is a subtle form of aggression towards ourselves.
Yes.
Right? So often I'll say to people when they come to the meditation class, I said, if you wanted a better version of yourself, this is a wrong class. I don't know where that is, but please send me the postcard because I kind of want that too.
Yeah.
Everything is welcome, right? Everything is welcome. What you want, what you don't want. And when you can practice that with yourself, you can extend that to something else, someone else, your situation. Yeah.
Other questions? Oh. Josh, we have a YouTube question as well? Great, we'll go there after.
I just want to jump back into our heads for a minute. I'm really curious about your concept. I love this idea of all religions, this river that runs below. I think people often look to religion for community, for moral, for the law. But I'm really curious just particularly what your thoughts are when you say there are certain tenets that are absolutely sort of the core of all of these different practices. I'd just be curious if there are a handful of those.
Yeah. I'm not sure that I call them tenets.
Okay.
Because that to me sounds a little bit more like beliefs, and beliefs can often be intellectual. No, it's I would say it's a sense of presence. Actually, I've seen a room full of advanced practitioners from different religions, and what I've seen is them sit in silence together, and there is a connection, a unity that is expressed in the silence beyond words. So it's hard. I'm reluctant to try to put it into words because it takes us back up here. It's a sense of connection. We're all in this together. That's the best I can do.
And it's that fundamental experience. The experience of being human is the same, really. There's this wonderful Buddhist story of this woman who loses a child, and she goes to Buddha for comfort. And the Buddha says, before I can give you the teachings, go to every house in the village and find a place find a family who has not had loss. And of course, she can't. The finding the sense of the common experience is the teaching. And I would say that's that river underneath us. Right.
And I think from the Baha'i faith, there's actually almost the same. Baha'u'llah, who was the founder of the Baha'i faith, said that there's the same core of spiritual truth in all religions, right? And sort of it names that, all the way through. So I feel like that same concept is very much, that there is this spiritual truth. I think that, the particular things, are what get us in trouble in terms of being able to, you think that, this and that and the other thing, and whether I have this food on that day or whatever. So,
Yeah.
I want to say that I read an article that said every single religion has a version of the golden rule.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
Can we go to a YouTube question, actually? Great.
The question is, thinking about Ukraine, for example, how might we, as spiritually oriented people, face into the reality of evil?
Can you say the last part of that?
Yeah. How might we, as spiritually oriented people, face into the reality of evil?
I will say one of the things that I just recently was talking about, sort of the way that I've been thinking about it and sort of relating to the Ukrainian situation is I'm not looking away. And I feel like that's my spiritual task right now. I'm not getting caught up in the 24/7 news so that I'm getting so riled up, and I feel like I have a responsibility not to do that. But I'm also not looking away, and I think that's happening worldwide, and I think that's making a difference.
Yeah, it's a tough question. I think I think it's a tough situation, and I think one of the things that is very clear is that humanity is reaching a point where we can't keep holding on to self-interest, and that's one of those primary expressions of self-interest in this case. I mean, that sounds too glib in some ways. I know the suffering is at a whole other level to make for me to sit on the stage in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and be like. But I think seeing that there's also a global response to this, right? And I think that is the thing that I don't want to say we have to work through it, right? So we don't really have a choice about working through it. But I think beginning to see a united global response to this kind of oppressive action is, maybe what we have to figure out, right? I don't know how else we get there. It's certainly the only kind of choice we see. I think there is that whole question of what do you do when you're looking into the face of evil? And I guess from my point of view, informed by the Baha'i tradition, ultimately there's kind of lack of light versus darkness. I mean, if you're thinking about evil as darkness, I mean, it's like we need to shine light on this, and I don't know that there's a difference between swift action that can make a difference in terms of quelling this kind of thing, versus developing hatred or trying to, and that's, I don't know what that balance is, but we got to figure it out, right?
Yeah.
So.
And I would add one thing, and I love your answer, Robert, to that. Actually, two things. One is I was a little bit careful about evil as a concept, because I have to be so careful that I'm not projecting it onto somebody else, taking something inside myself that I don't like and projecting it onto to someone else. But in addition to everything you just said, I think tears. I think tears are what's called for.
And I would just add to that, I had I'm thankful for this experience of working with an artist in Moscow, visual artist in Moscow who's doing some design work for another company that I consult with. And I've been really appreciative of understanding her experience, because it's not just a global response, but there's a response inside of Russia that feels the same way that we do and others out there. And I think that knowledge, along with the tears and along with doing whatever we can do as individuals to hold ourselves as a human species responsible for becoming better, it exists within that country as well. And I think it's important to know that as well. So thank you for that. Do we have other questions in the audience? Other questions on YouTube? No? Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here with us tonight in the theater. Thank you for tuning in from home. But perhaps most importantly, thank you, Robert, Liz, and Bill. I really appreciate you giving us your time, and I personally appreciate the opportunity to sit with you and learn from your experiences and chat with you for an hour. So thank you so much for being with us here tonight.